Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Japanese-style living environment webinar series. This is really a bonus webinar. The series is over, but it ain't over till it's over. So today we'll be in conversation about the evolution of traditional Japanese-style living environments and their suitability to our lives today. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to our partners who make this programming possible. It was the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership and the Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association. My name is Peter Bowyer, and I'll be your presenter today. And I want to give a shout out to our video editor, Kevin Judd, and announce to you all that he's about a quarter of the way through getting all the previous webinars ready for posting on YouTube. Thank you, Kevin. Okay, so join us for a journey through the evolution of the Japanese-style living environment, culminating in the Sukiya living environment. So throughout the day, let's discuss its application to the past, to the present, and to the future of human adaptation to circumstances such as stress, work, and home environments, dwellings. So let's draw on audience questions and comments on what you've seen in previous webinars in this series, other published material, all in hopes of enriching our public and private lives. So it's just a note, serving as director of this Japanese-style living environment webinar series has been very gratifying to me. So to all the many related volunteer learning opportunities serving with the Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association, the Merritt College Pruning Club, the Bonsai Garden at Lake Merritt, Hakone State and Gardens. Opportunities abound. So you're invited to continue your study of the natural landscapes, landscape architecture, and landscape horticulture, all at play in the Japanese-style living environment by joining with others in like-minded organizations. Always pays to format your various PowerPoints the same way. Okay. So welcome to the evolution of Japanese home and garden styles. There you go. So near the end of a watershed conference titled Japanese Gardens Outside Japan, garden builder Hoichi Kurisu stood up and declared, "We need a new 21st century direction or else the Japanese garden tradition will flounder." And since that conference, experts and enthusiasts have explored the question whether there is such a crisis, and if so, what is to be done. So Hoichi Kurisu later wrote that today the Japanese garden tradition is struggling in three main ways. One, first, technically, the lack of skilled labor and expertise. In the same viewpoints, essays in Sukiya Living magazine, March, April 2010, David Slauson wrote, "Japanese gardens in the West have been idolized and trivialized, seen by most as too esoteric or too expensive for home landscaping, and by landscape architects as too quaint or culture specific. Kurisu's second reason was varying interest in Japanese culture. And the third reason was the economy, meaning it costs too much. So back to that same collection of opinion essays in Sukiya Living magazine, once again, garden builder and author David Slauson elaborated similar points. He says, you've heard this. Japanese gardens in the West have been idolized and trivialized, seen by most as too esoteric or too expensive for home landscaping, and by the landscape architects as too quaint or culture specific. My apologies for the editing error. So the moral of the traditional Chicken Little story is to have courage, even when it feels like the sky is falling. The contributors to the Viewpoints essays bravely charted the way forward. And here's what they said. Historically, Japanese gardens have evolved as a response to the culture and politics of the times. Today's gardens should be no different. This is David Slauson. To keep the essence of our tradition moving forward, we must first consider what humanity today really needs, looking into our own cultures and responding with appropriate gardens. What we most need is to feel peace and comfort in our hearts. We need prevention of and relief from the stresses of modern and increasingly technological life, and to be reminded of our enduring connection to nature. Okay, that was all Hoichi Kurisu, sorry, not David Slauson. Here's David. We must focus this art form on its true purpose, creating gardens that satisfy our human need for nature's serenity by evoking natural patterns in a comfortable viewing context. Natural patterns. And Kendall Brown added, so Japanese gardens can function in ways that are less ornamental, less decorative or exoticizing, and more meaningful, more integral to and better integrated with our lives, not as a spectacle like a museum exhibit, but as spaces with which we actively participate. It doesn't stop there. Slauson adds, I see myself as part of a tradition of garden builders who give their imagination free rein in response to the client's wishes. The assets and liabilities of the site, available rocks and plants, and the garden builder's memories of nature and art. I believe Japan's landscape gardening tradition has universal application, and Sukiya living environments can be built any place on Earth, regardless of climate zone, ecosystem, and culture. This is the gift of Japanese gardens to the world. So this is Slauson's response to the crisis in what's to do and where to go next. He has company, David DeGroot, who is a bonsai master and former head of what was known as the Weyerhaeuser Bonsai Collection. It's just south of Seattle, Washington, a very exquisite collection. He added, the Sukiya environment is a reflection of how we see ourselves in the world. A deep respect for nature and a sense that we are part of it. Tellingly, The Sukiya-style house is built and appreciated almost as an extension of the garden, as following nature. Whereas Western gardens are often referred to as outdoor rooms, nature as an extension of the house. That is the Sukiya living environment should embody universal aesthetic principles is a given. Its unique expression is cultural. Sukiya Living Magazine, May, June 2010. And the publishers of Sukiya Living Magazine, one of them, Douglas Roth, in an opinion essay, wrote, "The human physiology and natural patterns that underlie the tradition are universal and not at all unique to Japan." So that's an incredibly condensed presentation there. And I think this is an appropriate time to unmute or, well, I can't do that for everyone, but this would be a very appropriate time if you have any questions to share them. And if you just type them into the box, I can actually put you on mic. And if there are no questions, we'll proceed. Well, it's a good time to ponder. The sky is falling, debate about whether the sky is falling, and then many opinions offered on what is this tradition that's in crisis? Why is it in crisis? And what eternal values it has that can be reinvented in new contexts. I find this very inspiring. And so we're going to now take a familiar tour through the past of evolution of this charming and healthful living environment. And we're going to discuss how it was an appropriate adaptation at the time, how it's since been adapted to meet new needs and in new places. And that, I think, will help us imbibe and make it our own, come up with answers to the world that we, each as individuals and collectively, are facing. So let's get into what is it? Here we go. So I think above all, the commentators were talking about an emotional response to nature. Now, everyone has emotional responses to all kinds of things. But this emotional response, ever since for the last 1,200 years, has been one of the core principles. And it's got a name, and I don't want you to get too lost in foreign language terms, but this one's important. It's called Fusei. So we'll talk about that more. Now, let's listen to some shares. Tim Gruner, curator of the Anderson Japanese Garden in Northern Illinois, one of the best. He said, "I began backpacking and hiking in amazing parks. I loved being immersed in nature, how it affected my thought, the way it made me feel. Later, I visited Anderson Japanese Gardens for the first time. I remember how experiencing the garden brought the same flood of feelings to me that I had felt in deep nature." While Japanese in origin, Sukiya living can be a vehicle in our everyday lives to such an important connection with nature. And that is beyond a culturally specific art form. Sukiya Living Magazine, May, June 2010. His Illinois colleague Jay Scuba added, the Sukiya living environment is a culturally specific art form that has transcended its origins, universally applicable. So this here is a photo of Matsushima Bay in Miyagi Prefecture. It's one of the top tourist destinations in Japan. There are thousands of these rugged islands. It's incredible. And this is a photo of Shoto-an, which is a Fusei-style garden. Shoto-en, or Ohana-en. This is in Yanagawa, Kyushu. And this looks a lot like Miyagi Bay to me. So the oldest gardening book in Japan, Sakuteki, said, you should design each part of the garden tastefully, recalling your memories of how nature presented itself for each garden feature. Think over the famous places of scenic beauty throughout the land and design your garden with the mood of harmony, modeling after the general air of such places. All of us experience stress in our modern lives. This is Sukiya Living magazine. And many Westerners have learned how refreshing it is to take a drive out into the countryside, to travel up in the mountains and to go hiking or swimming or fly fishing. Well, the Japanese tradition does the same thing. But instead of having to get into your car and drive way out into the countryside, the Sukiya-style garden brings that nature back home, where it can be enjoyed without having to get into a car to drive to where it can be enjoyed every day, not just on weekends. You get it every day. Many people, including young Japanese people, are interested in creating Sukiya living environments. Well, we're going to get to that quote later. So that's the big context. Now we're going to start with the evolution. The origins of this integrated home and garden living environment are believed to have started with hunting and gathering, hunting or fishing territory. That's just a little more linguistics, folks. That's the word niwa. And the implication is a unity of humanity and wild nature. Very romantic, you know, just like European romanticism, natural man. And so niwa also came to mean a place that had been cleansed and purified in anticipation of the arrival of kami. Now, this is a bit religious, but we're entertaining a hypothesis here, and that is, those are, I believe, the words of Mark Peter Keene, and we'll cite his book in a bit. So another origin of the word for garden is the agricultural field. That's pronounced sono. And this obviously implies control of nature. So you have this wonderful natural environment you're going to merge and feel a part of in a very profound, primeval way, and you're going to control it. So this is about the garden half of the Japanese garden, Sukiya-style living environment. So the modern word, now that we've left niwa and sono behind, is tein. which is also pronounced niwasono. You don't need to know all that. Just kind of remember it. So how did these gardens arise? Well, back in the old days when everyone was really too busy and not all that prosperous enough to have their own private residential garden, they had collective spaces. So making and clearing a space where humans feel the presence of kami, which is, kind of animistic spirits, happened all over the world. For those of you like me of European American descent, it's what we now call paganism. This Keene hypothesizes was another origin of gardening. That an inspiring natural landscape is a manifestation of this spirit, and an accommodation and a demarcation from mundane activity or mundane land follows. So you have special places, and here's a special place I visited where you see the wetted rocks and the portal marker. So think of it as walking through the doors into a place of worship. That's the hypothesis. So the marking with straw ropes and gates or frames, bird perches, if you really want to go into the Sanskrit, it's all good. It all points in the same direction, whichever myth or metaphor you choose to employ. So in order for humans to contemplate and meditate in this kind of state, you have to provide an accommodation, such as a clearing in the forest, or occasionally platforms at the water's edge, or in the water, or out on an island. So you want to go here. There's a famous one up in central Japan, but in western Japan, this is Futamigura Beach in Fukuoka City. So here's those platforms out in the water. They're called islands. And that's a wonderful creation myth. And for those of you who don't have a dictionary at hand, myth has two meanings. Very common meaning today is that it's a lie. But its original meaning, if you go back to its root, is it's a metaphor. It points you in a direction where words just cannot express. So it's meant to suggest, much the way a poem does. You do the rest. So here we have the Kami-ike ponds with islands. And this is linked with creation myths of the people of Japan coming from over the water, which is highly likely given their islands. Here's another. This will get you all you Druid fans excited. This is a clearing in the forest with this is an archaeological site. Here's a remnant platform for a small gathering. It'd be elevated, and that's very practical if it's cold and muddy. So thus the need for a little landscaping. This is somewhere in Nara Prefecture, and it's amazing they found it. Okay. So those are some possible ancient roots of the tradition. And now we're going to get into how it started to appear in people's dwelling environments, everyday dwelling, residential, go to work. So in no particular order, we're going to do house, what we would think of as the house, and the adjoining grounds. And they aren't always in these two combinations, but this is a slide of the chronologic progression where you'll see a housing style innovated and around about the same time, a garden style. And so they often occur together. But as we move forward in time, you're going to see these remnant houses that remodel their surrounds. So you'll have a more contemporary landscape surrounding a more prehistoric, or excuse me, not prehistoric, a more an older style of building residence. Okay, so just keep that in mind. I'll try and sort it out. This is familiar territory to a lot of you because I gave us this core of this presentation last month. In the aristocratic era, when the emperors were in charge, and the style was aristocratic in scale and very functionally driven as well. You can see that the core of this is a large, what we might call a parade ground. And as I understand, this is everything from reviewing your troops or your staff. Literally, you might walk up and down, have choice words for your subordinates, and tell everybody to stand up straight. But in general, it's a gathering of great pride, right, and solidarity. And then you might dispatch everyone to their day's tasks. So what does this remind me of in present day? Recently, it was still quite common for workers at a manufacturing plant in Japan to all gather first thing in the morning and actually do some physical warm-up exercises. Very practical. You'll become more awake, more alert. That's good for safety and for productivity. So here you have the royalty with their staff, troops, whatever. And in the present day, you'd have a factory complex. And this is not unlike an automobile assembly plant. What you're looking at, I'm sorry, the cursor's just idle here. Here's the central hall. And here you might have various residential buildings. And out here you have a couple of pavilions that today and maybe then might be useful for fishing or just hanging out at the beach. All in the comfort of being under roof and connected by, I'm moving the cursor now, I don't know if you can see that, connected by roofed walkways, raised and elevated, like the boardwalks of the Wild West, like our paved sidewalks today. So you have distinct operations or residences, separated but connected. Could be in a place with a really bad climate through underground tunnels. I lived in such a place one time where I commuted in the underground tunnels, much like the underground tunnels in the subway system and central train corridors of large Japanese cities today. Fukuoka, Kyoto, and undoubtedly Tokyo have vast shopping centers, restaurants, Lordy B, I was muted. So oh, I'm so sorry. So here is, we've been through the building, the Shinden, that's the central area, and the outlying pavilions. There's similarities to modern uses and their past uses for ceremonies, festivals. And here's the boating garden. And here you can see some islands. And this is the scene of the Tales of Genji, with the dashing Prince Genji and all this wonderful leisure time. So again, this is an aristocratic experience. Nowadays, the aristocrats are the factory owners, and they provide a similar campus, although no boating lake. Although, if you're ever in Silicon Valley, California, I recommend you visit the Oracle campus, and that's a big software company. And what you'll see there is a Heian boating garden attached to a building that has more of the aggregate diagonal character of later Shoin or even Sukiya-style architecture, all in black glass, and it's stunning. Okay, so here's an actual remnant of one of those Heian boating gardens. It's a very popular tourist destination, Gyodo-in in Uji, just south of Kyoto. And look at that lovely quality of water next to any kind of object. Provides this ethereal mirror reflection. And when you can frame the views of the most interesting features, the way these two tree branches do, so much more exquisite. So one point about this early architecture is being so hierarchical, it's raised quite high above the parade ground. And by the way, you can see the parade ground in the present day Gyodo-in is greatly reduced. Oh, I'll get back to that. In subsequent Japanese style living environments, the level of your eye relative to the surrounding landscape, your eye line is going to come down closer to the horizon. This is going to have a profound effect on how unified you feel with nature. This high point of view, you've seen it if you've ever been to a hillside home with a grand view window. Where I live, I'm in these places all the time, and they look out over the San Francisco Bay at the skyline of San Francisco. And it's an amazing tableau, but it's all far, far away. And in a sense, it's an impression, but there's very little interaction beyond being sort of impressed, like, whoa, blown away in slang, right? And then there's no chirp of birds. There's no sound of the lapping of waves. There's no feel of the wind in your face from that bay. So it's kind of like a big picture. It's a picture window. So it's great for impressing your guests with your wealth and power and prestige and good taste. But there are other alternatives. So right away, you can see the similarity of this to, oh, I don't know, the Capitol steps and the halls of Congress, the Parthenon and Greece, Athens, Greece, or surely they're, since all the United States government buildings are more or less patterned after the Romans ones, Rome has many hills and has many grand buildings on podiums raised above. And here you see the same at Byodo-in, a typical and quite glorious Heian style. And by the way, back in that day, all that building would have been painted bright vermilion like the Golden Gate Bridge. It's incredible orangey red. And this has been allowed to weather to natural tones in subsequent eras when the more natural look came into style. So here you see someone literally remodeling the exterior of the property through neglect. Back to Byodo-in. When you go there, you can read you learn in a vague sort of way that the grounds are a mere fraction of their former extent, and that the pond used to be more extensive. And this is, there's no precise records, but you get the feeling that where the pond is now used to be the gravel parade ground. And where the pond used to be, well, that's now a parking lot adjoining, you're smack dab in the middle of downtown Uji practically. So this site is, heavily altered. Okay, so here's a proper parade ground. And this is a typical Heian parade ground, but this is a rebuilt building in a later style. So it's a Heian area courtyard fronting a Shoin, perhaps, style architecture. Shoin is large scale, formidable, formal, stout structure. So this one you can go see at the Kyoto Imperial Palace. It's the Goen. The building's called the Shishinden. I promised I wouldn't do that. So you can see that there's no longer the flanking pavilions connected by covered walkways in this later architectural style. And here you've got a different roof style. The hipped, which meets at the four corners. You see that on the lower half. That's a characteristic of the Shoin. And then the gabled roof, which is the upper half. So this combination of a hipped and gabled roof, that's very Shoin. These particular form of movable walls are kind of unique, and I don't want to go there. And this is fairly typical for a Heian courtyard in that there was minimal landscaping, and there was often these symbolic trees. In this case, it's a cherry tree on the right and an orange tree on the left. Very early times, it wasn't the homegrown cherry at all. It's when they were copying the more powerful palace in Beijing. That fashion would have an Ume plum, which apparently was an import from China. So, c'est la vie. We do the same, don't we? So here's another garden in Kyoto. This is part of the Heian Jingu Shrine, which is only about 120 years old, and attempt to recreate that experience. Here we are walking on a covered pavilion from one place to another, looking out into the boating garden. Just a taste. They're primarily for viewing, not for boating, and certainly not for strolling. Although, you saw the path earlier. Go back there. You can see the path out onto the islands, but you can tell that that's not all that interesting a walk. Okay. So another characteristic of that early style was the winding stream that fed the lake. Now, that's only logical. And this is a wonderful device connecting the core to the periphery, is it not? And if you prowl the grounds of Byodo-in, you can see the stream in typical fashion coming around from somewhere else from behind, passing under the raised pavilion, such as the one in the previous image, and emptying into the pond. Now, ever since I was a kid, I've always enjoyed rock hopping up streams. I wanted to follow them to their point of origin. This goes on all over the world. Searching for the origins of the river is vintage. It's Lewis and Clark exploring the headwaters of the Missouri. It's ancient pilgrims from India following the major rivers there all the way up to their source in the Himalayas, to Mount Kailash, and so forth and so on. So absolutely amazing to find that same impulse employed in a residence. Big ideas for little places. And look how exquisite this particular stream is. This is a fashioned in a meadow. Lovely. And that's at Motsuji in Hiraisumi. That's northern Japan. Gotta go there. Okay, here is another example of the landscaping style from that early Heian period. Never mind, those are not Heian buildings in the background. That's more, that's kind of temple architecture from later on. But one of the things that went along with that monumental aristocratic scale was evocations of the mountains of southern China, which kind of look like this. They're real tall, and there's lots of them. And I'd love to go there too. But when you have one of these near your front entrance, it's off to the right, you can go there in your mind every time you approach the entry. So the point was being made. Not everyone has those cars where we can jump in and wade through hours of traffic just to get to overcrowded Yosemite to see wonders like this. If you think upon the famous places throughout the land and recreate the landscape with the general mood and harmony of such places, you can have that experience that Tim Gruner had the first time he walked into Anderson Gardens, and I don't know where he was back to, Utah, the Grand Canyon, but he was transported. So that's the idea, and here you see it from the early on. So this particular temple, Tenryuji, in the far west of Kyoto City, very much the, well, no, hold on. They say that the original iteration of the grounds, well, this is just the front door, but in back is a big pond garden. And they say that was very much in the spirit of a Heian boating garden, but it's subsequently been, you know, remodeled. Plants grow and pass away and fashions change. But you can still get the flavor of it there, a very peaceful setting. I'll try and pick up the pace. So that's our review of the sort of Shinden architecture and boating garden, and my opinion that it relates a lot to governmental manufacturing and other large-scale things. In an earlier presentation, I thought it would be a lot of fun for a hotel. It reminds me of the Bellagio, a casino in Las Vegas, which is also a commercial establishment that's welcoming the public in, giving them an awesome lure in terms of a water fountain show in the big pond, and then you're meant to be so impressed that you file inside to see what else lies in store, and then you patronize the establishment. This is not unlike the villas of ancient Rome with their incredible waterworks and impressive entry garden, all designed to put you in a mood of like enthusiasm and awe and respect for your host. We're going to contrast that later on with the Roji, the tea garden path, which is a far more of an entry, a sort of a glide into a more contemplative or meditative state. So motivated by a fundamentally different ethic, not an aristocratic one, but an egalitarian one. So there's a little teaser, hang in there. So we're about to pass into showing style, and I'm gonna, let's see, done. It's quite usual that everyone is being deferential to the flow of the presentation. And then when we have free time at the end, can go all the way back to the beginning. You can ask questions about anything. So those are the early days of homes and gardens, and they're fairly well integrated. And I think they're still alive and well today. You know, and those of us who've taken the Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association tour of the Ellison estate. By the way, that's the guy with the Oracle Garden on the commercial campus. He has a private home garden as well. And don't call him up. He's unlisted and you don't want to hear from you. But OFSCA, thanks to our intrepid longtime leader, Leanne Scott, we got an in. So, and you can view the splendors of this fellow's private grounds if he continues to grant us occasional access on a fundraiser basis. So I might add that aside from the Bellagio Casino, I am also thinking of the pond feature in Central Park, Manhattan, New York City, USA, which is an example of how we, the voting public, elected a leadership and allowed and imposed taxes upon ourselves and had them develop this wonderful city Central Park in the mid 1800s, which became a model for similar Central Parks adjoining Brooklyn, Prospect Park, Golden Gate Park in New York City. Every city has a major Central Park now, and a lot of them feature refreshing water. And that gets me back to our primeval origins. Some say we crawled or wriggled out of the pond muck and onto the land and developed legs. And, you know, you can go to similar enclosures like this at your large municipal zoos and see the seals recapitulating our evolution. Okay. All right, on to the next leg of our journey. So what happened was all that silly dallying by the pond weakened the grip of the aristocracy. While they were doing that, their staff were busy usurping power. It was the first version of the deep state. And so famously, if the aristocrat is the ruler of the land and the prime minister is in charge with the day-to-day tasks of government, the appointed prime ministers, so to speak, they eventually wrested power and still were like the power behind the throne. But then that whole system eventually got overthrown. And we had a new group of people rise as the generative force for, you know, new culture. And in Japan, those were the warriors, so known as the samurai. And when they became ascendant, they had a rather analogous to the Puritan ethic in the Christian Reformation. They said, away with all this frivolous extravagance. We want a lifestyle that's simple, strong, focused on what really counts, core stuff. So we've all lived through the defunding of the arts and education. And so we kind of know what this looks like. In our present age, it's driven by um, business owners, capitalists who say we want all energies reinvested in more production. We need more material splendor. Who needs to contemplate? We're animal beings and we merely need to reproduce for our material needs and so forth. So they worship a different god. All right, here we go. Enough editorializing. So the architectural style that arose is showing, and you're not getting much of a very good picture of it here. It was the ethic of simplicity and strength. And what this photo is of the main hall or entry point of a showing structure. And if you've been there, this is actually the first building, the oldest building at the Katsura Rikyu, detached villa. So this, excuse me, so this was aristocratic in origin, but done remember, this aristocracy is now impoverished, so they don't have their hands, they can't control the treasury anymore. They're given an allowance by the warrior class. They had to innovate and become more efficient in their building style and a little less ostentatious. So you don't see any of the ornamentation, all the incredible carvings that you saw at the Byodo-in, which the paint job, by the way, would have accentuated. So this main hall for entry is located away from that large gravel gathering court, the formal entry court. There still might be some kind of entry court if you had status, or what we might know of as a front yard, if not. And that's because all entrances from the public realm to the front door are inevitably some form of a funnel. This is a universal in architecture and landscape architecture, indoors and out. And you pass through the door and suddenly it's a reverse funnel. You expand into the entry hall or foyer. Locating the entry away from the main gathering point is more similar to fort construction, which we got to later in all these countries, because it's more defensible to defend the choke point, the narrow point of the funnel. And the samurai class, it was also a very unstable time, warring lords, so forth, each of them trying to, might makes right and so forth. So it's a very practical style in that regard. You see that today in people's urban homes where, most of the people on the other side of the property line are complete strangers and you want some control over your entry. So fenced perimeters with gates, and or a series of gates, at least an external perimeter gate, and then your front door is another kind of a gate. Okay, just a quick glance at the interior. This showing style, all these experts say it's borrowing from the temple architecture or other, ruling class styles needed, to entertain or educate as well as to provide quarters. So again, military rule, we're talking hierarchy. I don't care where you are in that hierarchy, you've been delegated to interact with and, control your subordinates. So therefore you have to have a place suitable for entertaining. And here might be an indoor hall for entertaining. It'd be the equivalent of a Euro-American dining room or living room. I'm going to use the cursor now. On the left here, this is terrible drawing. This is actually a window with those louvers there. And, you know, those would be the paper screens with thin wood louvers, you know, as shoji. And here the little arrow says writing alcove. Well, it's not a very good example, but there might be some kind of a desk surface right at the window. Why? No electricity, and let's face it, lamps are not so great. So you probably would have wanted to do your writing during the day by natural light. Here's an alcove. Notice the raised floor right there. And then boop, you're up into this area. So right away, you're not just easily storming in there. Loose rolling objects aren't just going to go crashing into the alcove and upend your vase of flowers or ding into your hanging scroll, which is, you know, kind of a painting. And then over here for practical necessities, we have cabinetry. Here's some enclosed cabinets. And here's these super fun staggered shelves. So modern, right? And up here you might have a transom. Usually transoms are between rooms. So like this area over to the right above these large sliding doors, that could be a carved wood transom or a shoji transom to let light reflect into the next room. And the wonderful thing about paper is whatever light hits it, it diffuses it in all directions on both sides. So it's far more efficient than having a single beam that you have to follow around all day, you know, with your novel or page turner, you know what I mean? And the decorative doors, if you're hosting your subordinates, they would be painted canvas. They'd be paintings, and you'll see lots of those when you tourist. Just lovely, very common. I recommend for an experience of this on the grand scale that you go to the Nijo subway station, get off and go into the Nijo Castle complex and the main building there. And you'll be suitably impressed and awestruck and in a properly humble mood to meet your superiors there. Only you won't. Who needs the aristocracy anymore? All right. Well, I want to go back there one thing. You might, you can't see it in this thing, but when you go to Nijo, you're probably going to have a sort of a coved ceiling, which is kind of something you see in all those British dramas. And, you know, practically speaking, you'd have wooden shutters protecting these more fragile kinds of windows. And this innovation of wall-to-wall carpeting, the tatami mats, right? They're a woven rice mat with stuffing, and needless to say, you take your shoes off the entrance so you don't shred the tatami and grind dirt into it and so forth. All righty. And keep that in mind next time you visit Japan, shoes off. And here's a, so I'm going to give you the full view here. I don't know what's with this. So here's what you might encounter adjoining the entertainment room, the room for audience, as the case may be, your meeting room. You'd have a lovely evocative landscape. It might put you at ease, give you something to be awed and appreciation of. Again, when you go to Nijo the Nijo Castle, and you get to the main room with the impressive wall paintings and cove ceilings, it opens up, it looks out over a narrow, not so narrow gravel passage. Again, you got a lot of troops hanging around the castle, at a spectacular garden of large scale in everything, amazing water, huge boulders, and once again, you're meant to be awestruck. You're a fan of mid-century movies, from Hollywood, you'd see the poor employee is summoned to meet with the boss, who's sitting at the end of a large hall, big enough for a cathedral, right? With cathedral high ceilings and an incredible, he's behind a desk on a raised dais like the nave, right? And there's this gigantic vertical cathedral window behind, and you can't see the guy's facial features, only his silhouette, all meant to intimidate you. So these military rulers formed alliances with local, rulers of local places, and they had to reward them and at the same time intimidate them to command their loyalty. So here you see the sliding doors, allowing the indoor-outdoor interaction. Still a fairly heavy building, and there might, in this case, this is a sort of an perimeter hallway, and then the entry hall might be on the other side of another set of doors, although that's really more a characteristic of the later Sukiya-style. So when you get to the Nijo Castle, just not really showing residential, mind you, it's aristocratic in scale. There is a hallway, but then boom, you're looking straight through it onto the garden. Okay, as I recall. Okay, this here's a temple, and I just want to say that this warrior ethic of frugality, replacing the extravagance of the aristocratic era that preceded it, there's a lot more emphasis on a simplified landscape palette. Mind the aristocrats of early Japan were just like the well-to-do in Great Britain during the height of that empire, the 1800s, the age of discovery, right? They're going all over the world and bringing home exotic animals, and the zoos are, being populated with all these poor captives, and they're bringing home exotic plants like palm trees and orchids. They're building glass houses, and it's all about opulence, and the more the better. It's just blow them away, amaze yourself, and delight in every new discovery. So it's kind of like a kid in a candy store. And, they could just go out and kind of bring it all home. This ethic of simplicity is also found in the form of religious or spiritual philosophy favored by that ruling class, which is, of course, Zen. And so this is a Zen temple, and the warrior class, which is kind of like, by and large, middle class and upper middle class. Some of them are outright, at the top. They're essentially living the life of an aristocrat. But this is very affordable. It's just shrubs and gravel. You can go dig that at the river. Not anymore, mind you. It's all tapped out. And you don't have to move gigantic stones. You don't have to command a large budget and many laborers. So here we see it diffusing down the economic ladder through the warrior class gardens, and in a way that's less taxing on the land and resources of the nation. I mean, literally hundreds of years to build the pyramids of Egypt. What a brain drain. I mean, what a drain on your citizenry. You could have been doing other things. And the samurai would have told you, yes, you should have been fortifying the perimeters of the empire and so forth. So it's all about being prudent. Okay, I'm going to give you the full screen here too. We all know this one. Here's a greater detail of the dry garden viewed from the adjoining structure. Get there early to Ryoanji. And of course, at a temple like Ryoanji, This is intended for mental exploration rather than physical entry. So unlike the Heian boating garden, which permitted some entry by boats and even sometimes paths and bridges, this was, unless you were out there pulling weeds, it's just meant to be part of your experience from inside the building. This is a key innovation. Uh, yeah, more a focus on inner realization than on the material world. A lot's been made of the fact that being a warrior was a spectacular, albeit brief, career. So, hold on. For those who favor this kind of garden, it also it's definitely a mystical, uh, popular device for mystics, put it that way. And many attribute to this a focus on inner realization, like I said, and subtlety, but subtle but profound, even maybe things too deep to be seen. So first time I did tourism in Kyoto, it was how many gardens can I pack in a day? And I'd sort of dash through them with my camera blazing and on to the next one. And then later, when I'd done that circuit, I went back a second time and I'd just sit there with a sketchbook and a journal, you know. And it was amazing as you start to write about any subject, especially when you're looking at, as soon as you get one thought out of your mind, that's the Q&A feature here, by the way, folks, a new thought arises. And meditators across traditions will remark on that. Your mind's quite a busy little fellow. So you just put them down on paper as almost like a Post-it, like get to this later, and it clears the way for you to go even deeper. So I was able to knit together scattered pieces of knowledge and sensory experience and start, you know, connecting them up in my journal or sketching. And it was a profound experience, much more worthwhile. Well, cataloging the pictures, you're benefiting from it now, but in the end, it's the narration, the meaning we bring to it that matters. Enough on that. Here's another one of those Zen temples, also very famous. This one is a viewing only garden as well. That little stone bridge leads to nowhere unless you need to pull a weed over there and you don't want to tread through the carefully raked gravel. Got it? So I'm standing on, and see it on the bottom left corner, I'm standing on that perimeter porch. It's under the roof. It's enclosable or open to the elements, depending on where you're at. It's wooden, so it is good to protect it from the elements with the roof and with the sliding, or in many later cases, removable panels that would make up a wall in between the rather widely spaced load-bearing timbers. So we're going to get to that innovation, but we're already headed that way. So it's Mark Peter Keene says that later in the this early warrior era, things got really out of hand. Hey, that was last week, wasn't it? And these gardens became more and more escapist, more enclosed and more introspective. So there's nothing wrong with taking the time out and engaging in some introspection and looking for a way through. And how do we reconnect with our core values and reinvigorate them so that, you know, the Republic may stand, right? So this is very relevant to our times today. During this time, people did turn to philosophy and mythology and religion, and so you start to see these more cultural landscapes, that is, images from belief systems. talk about mythical places. Again, they didn't have photography during the day, but places no one had actually been to and sketched, but they'd heard accounts of other travelers, or indeed there are stories that they're what you would say, they may not be journalistically correct, but they point to a larger truth. So metaphors, every religion has them, and so does every country. So that's what behaviors they elicit is what really counts, I guess. So trying to pick up the pace. The word for these dry gravel gardens, gravel and rocks, translates roughly as dry mountain water. So, you could put plus signs between those. And that term is kare san sui. So sui is water, san is mountain, and kare dry. So kare dake is a dry waterfall, and so forth. So this is the Silver Pavilion at Ginkaku. I think it's an excellent example. This could be an agricultural field on the left. It could be the incoming tide into some kind of, and to the right, a sandy beach. And there a bit of a dune. And then in the distance, of course, the volcanic mountain, Fuji for people near Tokyo. So, but again, it could be something entirely different to you. That was just my imagination. So on to the showing architecture. Good Lord, he takes his time. Indoor, outdoor views are significant, though more limited than the later Sukiya-style structure. You know the photo I'm getting to. So rooms, and I'm standing in it, may have sliding doors or windows either set or windows set into fixed walls. So you have both sliding doors and the windows set in fixed walls. And you might have a double set of sliding doors, one out onto the Engawa, where my friend is seated, or another set of sliding doors that opens onto the garden. I anticipated that in the prior slide. The perimeter hallway is clearly visible here. It's call it a veranda, if you will. In Japan, it's called an engawa. And this is, again, Shoto-en, Ohana-en, and Yanagawa, Kyushu. And here's kind of a fairly typical showing structure from the outside, again at Ginkaku, Silver Pavilion. And there you can see it's a fairly stout building. You can barely see the hip. You can see the hipped roof and just the end of one gable up there. Let's give you a little more. There you go. And then located fairly close to the garden. And a fairly limited amount of the wall is actually openable, or at least opened in this instance. Sometimes, again, these things can all be tracked and stacked over one panel. In this case, I see it's divided by thirds. So in theory, such a building could have heavy sliding doors and open 2/3 of the way up. The timber framing certainly could accommodate that. It's whether you want to be that open and vulnerable, per se. So that's all very fine and good, but for the showing era and the predominance of this warrior ethic with some kind of vestigial aristocratic hierarchical, the need to impress and exercise power. Here comes an entirely different kind of power. It's maybe the late 1500s, and someone issues the call, the rough equivalent of make love, not war. And that would be the famous tea master, Sen no Rikyu. So, and what he meant by that was really more an ethic of a return to simplicity and more about equality. And believe it or not, this is going to catch on with the warrior class. And I find that very interesting. So the famous term from this era is wabi-sabi, and I'm nowhere near qualified to answer that. And I think our wonderful presenter, Frank Church, did an excellent job in the earlier presentation. You can lump them or split them, the two terms, but it's back to simplicity, but a refined simplicity. So we're not just talking about living in squalor here. And the gracefulness of things that are aged and well used. So it reminds me of how blue jeans with holes in them are always coming back into fashion. You know, or vintage clothing at the very least. So the appreciation of things grown graceful with age is a big part of this ethic. And whereas the serving of tea, which has a major following, tea ceremony, tea has always been served throughout these different eras. And it's been everything from highly lacquered, you know, really expensive pots and saucers and cups down to this more homespun. Now I'm thinking of Mahatma Gandhi. Your mind starts to link them up. So the setting is back to nature with a vengeance. And really, the image of the forest is the predominant one. For most of these folks, getting away from civilization meant getting away from the developed coast and having to go up into the high ground in the mountains where it would be forested. So, so that's not a law. You can have this experience of tea on a desert island, you know, if you're ever shipwrecked. You can, you know, anywhere in the world, in other words. And indeed, you wander into a Bedouin's tent and they're famous for hospitality. I'm sure you'll be served the equivalent and you'll definitely be welcome. So the tea ceremony is universal across ages and nations and a very fitting symbol for making peace with people you may be having in conflict. So in my lifetime, the usual MO for guys was first you have a quarrel and then you're supposed to go have a beer together and, you know, patch it up and become pals. And of course, if you have many beers together, by the way, I don't drink, but if you have many beers together, we all know, you are stripped of your pretense and basically you all get down on the same level, a very common level. And there's a kind of humility in that as well. So learn even from louts. So one of the key features of this, if you look straight into that building, is the floor is practically ground level. Amazing. Also, notice the rustic thatched roof. Ah, the virtuous peasant. Yes. And earthen plaster over wicker frame for the walls. Certainly, we've seen a lot of plastered walls in some of the earlier buildings, but this is a particularly rustic treatment of it. And also in some places, like this is actually a deluxe tea structure, it's not really a residence. You'll see these pillars are actually logs with the bark still on. So a style repeated in other places in the world at similar cultural moments. So this is at Katsura Rikyu, and it's called the Pine Lute Tea Pavilion. So this family was aristocrats, and even though they weren't loaded and they had to use simple construction methods, and who better to borrow from than people with simpler lives and simpler budgets, but they still wanted to entertain. So they had robust social lives. So we don't have to constantly be grasping for more gold to have the good things in life. This is part of the tea aesthetic as well. So natural materials throughout. So you're looking up under the eaves there. To the left is the thatch roof. And then here's kind of what amounts to plywood, these thin stalks of reed, and thicker stalks of bamboo is providing purlins, and bundled smaller bamboo in tic-tac-toe patterns is really more like skip sheathing for the carpenters in the audience. Okay, but what's the experience for the person actually visiting the tea garden? And here you start. Here we are at the approaching a restaurant near Fukuoka in the town of Dazaifu. And it all starts with an enclosed sanctuary space. Now, this is different than an enclosed garrison like the warrior class, or an enclosed, call it what you will, castle, pleasure palace of the aristocracy. But nevertheless, you're going to create peace and quiet. You usually remove yourself and close the door. So we're about to enter the outer garden, and it's going to be relatively open. I'm standing in the street. Notice the funnel leading to this squeeze point at the gate, and then it will expand into the outer garden. When you get in the outer garden, here we are. This is at Yusentei in Fukuoka, I think the most charming garden in Fukuoka. The outer garden is quite extensive. You're in the forest. In this case, you're kind of in a forest perimeter. It's a deciduous forest. You see the dappled light. This isn't like Mirkwood, you know, in the Lord of the Rings. This is a friendly forest. And here, for your convenience, as you're now going to have tea with a friend and enter their home, you get to wash up. So I actually lived in a place where we tapped a muddy, mucky spring. We just kind of made a little dam and put in a hollowed out a log with a long hot poker and literally burned through the core, plugged it through the dam and propped it up with a brace right at the road's edge, and we could go fill up with fresh water for the house anytime we needed it, which was frequently. Okay, so not only do you get to wash up, but now you're going to be made comfortable while you sit and enjoy the garden. And this is really more of a gazebo here, not in a tea garden, but it gives you the idea that the waiting spot is a deluxe bus shelter. All right, these machiai, so from the verb to wait. And you enjoy the outer garden, and this puts you in the mood. You're supposed to decompress, let off gas. This is one of the themes of that integrated living environment. And this is part of a journey towards an encounter. And you want this encounter to be at a profound level. And for that to occur, you need to relax and leave your troubles outside the gate. Leave your troubles behind. So if you're ever in Oakland, California, I invite you to visit Kohan-en, otherwise known as the Japanese Friendship Garden in Lakeside Park, Oakland, California. And you can have a sit in this wonderful azumaya, and you can look at these beautiful iris on the shores of a small pond. Delightful. So here's our friends at the middle gate. We've been summoned by the host at the tea house beyond to pass out of the outer garden and follow the path to our waiting host. So this inner garden is going to be more forested. Now, there's some kind of universal cue going on there to do with humanity and our ages of experience there. And I pose that as a question. I'd be interested in your answers. Some say this evokes the passage from the town to the hermitage, right? Who's the one who tuned in, turned on, and dropped out? It's the hermit monk. So here's a quote from the Guide to the Gardens of Kyoto by Mark Tribe and the late Ron Herman. The tea garden led to the tea ritual. It was a vehicle for transition more than an elaborate landscape in and of itself. It's a vehicle for transition. Movement and transition, both physical and psychological, underwrote its design. Here we are approaching the tea structure, and just to emphasize the practical nature of things, we've already checked in at the lavatory to wash our hands, maybe to drink a little water. Here is a little dust pit. When, as you can see, our host pulled a few weeds at the last minute and just stuffed them in here. This is actually another sign that you may enter. It shows that the host has completed preparations. So it's not unlike the green signal at a crosswalk. And here you go. Here you're about to enter a tea house, and there's some interesting and very democratic features about this. Right over here, only about as high as the view of this gate. In other words, a waist-high entry, a low-set small opening, requiring all to bow upon entering. So here's a quote from Mark Peter Keene again. The humility inherent in the act of bowing before entering reinforce the ideal that all who enter the tea room are equals, a radical frame of mind for a hierarchical society. Oh yeah, so this is at the Sento Gosho, Kyoto. Tea gardens prompted advances in path aesthetics. So we're ways away from the gravel now. And the more formal arrangements, also transitioning to informal as one progressed. So remember our sidewalk entry to the tea garden a few slides back. And now as we get, and on the right, you'll see the somewhat formal sidewalk, right? Nobedan paving with rocks with a flat side. And now as you get deeper in the forest, higher up the mountain, you're just jumping from boulder to boulder. And that's what these zigzag tobi-ishi at the left are. So nothing's taken for granted. Even the most prosaic and bit players have a role in reinforcing the unifying theme. The intention of every item is harmonious with the overall intention. Okay. Here's another wonderful thing about tea aesthetics. These are presumably broken roof tiles, or in any case, used up roof tiles. It only said the last 20 to 30 years there, even though they're made out of clay, which I find astounding. I thought they'd last longer. So when they start to become brittle, or the crust of the bread starts to wear off, so to speak, and they become more porous, less capable of shedding water, they start to absorb more water. This is a problem. for wooden structure, and to find them reused in walls, or in this case, paths, is just delightful. And it so reminds me of the found art movement, artists who just work with junk and see a new life in it. It's a material representation, I think, of the concept of redemption as well as the concept of thrift, finding a use for everything. Of course, I worked on some farms, and these barns just get full of recycled barbed wire and timbers from such and such, and yeah, that was at Yusente in Fukuoka. So here we are back to the Katsuo-rikyu entry, and you can see a combination of the very formal steps straight out of Rome, right, with the semi-formal Nobedan sidewalk strips. That's fairly formal for a path, of course. And then these complete and semi-formal diagonal square stepstones, and then the utterly informal sort of curvilinear, irregular 5 and 6 and several sided stones. And there they are, all in one image. A very curious combination, but we can plainly see two main paths of entry converging on the entry. But people always want a shortcut here and there, and rather than formalize those in well and turn this into basically a concrete plaza, they use these informal stones according to the meeting the need, which is less frequent and rather informal behavior. So I liken this to you go visit someone in the hospital and you're told to follow the red stripe to this ward and the yellow stripe to the other ward, and so forth. And here's a better look at the greater the degree of curvature in an S-shaped path, the more informal the movement is. This is for a more leisurely journey. A lot's been made of the point that it directs your gaze left and right rather than fixed on the terminal destination. And this more varied journey, for those of us who've driven on the vacation versus the pleasure of being a passenger by window in a car, we know the difference. All right. Now, that was T, and following from that is going to come what many consider to be the full flowering of all these threads of tradition. At this time, I check in with you, ask you if you have any questions on the material to date. We are attempting to build on this chronological progression, so we don't want you to leave anything behind that you might need later. Ken asks, could you name some publications or books that explain some of the examples and ideas you've been covering in your excellent presentation? Yes. Ken, I want you to know that at the end of the show, I have a slide with some core books that will elaborate on points in this presentation. And I'm happy to elaborate on those at that time. And I think that'd be a good time for live discussion. I'm sure there are other people in the audience who have ideas as well. And so I'd encourage you, Ken, for the benefit of all, to also post this in the chat. And I'm sure that'll provoke a lot of input from other members of the audience. So draw on the wisdom of the community. I have my favorites, but I'm by no means read them all. Who has time? And then Hiromi asks, hi, great webinar as usual. I was wondering if you can announce, aha, okay. This is as good a time as any to announce this grant, and I think perhaps at the end, when we're thanking the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership, would be another time to reiterate, because maybe not everyone's back from the break. So Hiromi wishes to announce a new grant called the Salary Assistance Grant, and the Japan Foundation's new project, Mask Up 2020, both of which can be viewed on the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership website. And I have that website on our closing slide. So these are both questions we're going to revisit. For now, up to the moment, Ken, we've been drawing heavily on images from two locations, primarily Fukuoka, Japan, is in the west and very proximate to Korea. And Kyoto, of course, is in the center and very tourist friendly. I'm telling you, the major bus routes have stops announced in English as well as Japanese, probably other languages by now as well. So further images, you can, some of these are images on the commons over the internet, and a few were borrowed from friends. So books, overwhelmingly the narrative at the beginning, and to resurface in a bit, overwhelmingly the narrative is driven by these quotes I've lifted, primarily from Sukiya Living magazine with permission, but also from other writers, notably the Mark Peter King's excellent treatment of the traditional garden styles in Japan, found in his book, Japanese Garden Design. So that's just a teaser, and there's a few more listed. All right, excellent questions, by the way. We will come back to them. Okay, we are recording, and on we go. So we started with the aristocratic homes and gardens, and then we went into the warrior ethic and the associated garden styles, which were also prevalent in the Zen temples, so closely tied. And of course, those temples are very accessible to tourism. Getting invited into private homes is, you know, obviously not as accessible, but if you're in a Japan, US, or Japan, name your country, Sister Cities International is an international movement, so you can have a friendship sister city association in your town, and it doesn't take many people to get one started. And core activities of such associations are usually exchanges. Literally, you go visit them, and they come and stay with you, and you show each other around, and through you learn to appreciate and understand other people's, and this is really a form of citizen-to-citizen diplomacy from which folks from, well, at least that we know, from President Dwight Eisenhower on down, had hoped would contribute to world peace. And, certainly in this age where we have to demonize the other as being responsible for all our tribulations and aggravations, actually spending time like getting to know someone who's like the evil other might open your eyes. You might find that they're just like you. Okay. So all this is leading up to the sort of the pinnacle and accomplishment of this tradition evolving more or less in isolation from people in other parts of the world. Again, in the early times, the aristocrats were importing plants like the ume plum and so forth. And that was because they were at the far eastern end or even just off of the network called the Silk Road, which stretched from Rome to Beijing and north and south. So even early Japanese aristocrats had some imports, but with the thanks in part to being an island nation and the ups and downs in the freedom of movement internationally. I mean, merchants still are pursuing free trade, right? And that kind of means they want to traipse along the Silk Road without getting robbed by highwaymen and or pirates at sea. So that's still going on. And that was certainly operative throughout the warrior rule era in Japan. And really intensified in this period known as Edo. The last, say from 1600 on till the mid 1800s, there was almost no contact whatsoever. So what you had, what this does throughout the world, biologically speaking, is it allows for this blooming of divergent diversity. And therefore you come up with unique expression of universal human needs. And that's why we so delight in traveling to other places and seeing how other people go about pretty much the same kind of business we do, although it may appear to be different on the surface. So here we are entering into that era now. Late 1500s, Sennu Rikyu starts this movement, the way of tea, simplicity, no more ostentation whatsoever, no need to impress people with power. New Agers call it soft power, it's a sort of a reformation and a reinvigoration, going back to the core, and yet it's also, Godzilla goes and splashes in Tokyo Bay for a reason, right? Is to get his strength back, to lick his wounds and heal, and then get back to, go back to work, essentially. So, that's a vacation for Godzilla. And so as simple as that funny entertainment was, it expressed a profound truth. And that's what you're supposed to come home to every day in this living environment, integrated living environment. So let's resume with the fruits of this new reform. So you may recall that the early Sukiya tea buildings weren't much more than small rustic huts and shelters. I mean, we saw a deluxe one at Katsura, but there's actually a museum recreation of Sennu Rikyu's original home or tea home, and it wasn't much. It was humble. He started out low budget. Nevertheless, these rustic things did influence the larger, more deluxe showing style architecture, building architecture, in favor at the time. And kind of gradually and imperceptibly, there's a dialogue between the two, and they sort of start to converge. That was terrible English, but showing borrows from Soan, from the tea structure, and vice versa. Some of the budget, some more resources start pouring into these tea culture, and they improve the quality. And so what you get is a refined simplicity. And that is really characteristic of this thing we call Sukiya. So Sukiya roughly translates to like aficionado. I mean, Suki is something you really love or you really appreciate, in the sense you appreciate good music. So I'm not an authority beyond that. So you get the ample space and more sturdy construction of the showing is incorporated into these rustic structures. They get a little bigger, and vice versa. The formal showing incorporates the informal, simple aesthetic features and the more modest proportions of T buildings. And so the result is a full-blown Sukiya-style building, not just a hut no more. Building that was usable for housing a family unit. So we're way beyond knocking back a few T's here. That was a quote from, again, from Sukiya Living magazine with some of my butchery. Sukiya residences, they bring the viewer's eye level closer to the garden, as we noted earlier, and looky here, certainly closer than the showing on average. So this is a Sukiya-style room on a larger structure at Murin-an, which is a wonderful tourist destination in the city of Kyoto. Here's another quote. This was written in editorial by Doug Roth in Sukiya Living magazine, July, August 2012. In the beginning, a Japanese garden was something outside that surrounded my house. As the years went by, I started to realize that the so-called garden subject was bigger than just outdoor spaces. What I had previously called a garden tradition also included, and in fact was centered on, the house. The house was the primary element, with the outdoor spaces playing a supporting role. Nowadays, so time has elapsed, I see the Japanese tradition as being about a family's lifestyle, with the house structure, interiors, and garden spaces all playing supporting roles. July, August 2012. So it's not just architecture we're dwelling on here, but this architecture facilitates a greater level of integration. Now you might notice, you can see the perimeter veranda here, fully visible, protected by the roof overhead. Then you can see some things that look like windows. They are. This structure is actually rather young. And there's the sliding door. What's notable here is that all these walls are capable of either sliding or just being sort of lifted and carted away. And we'll get to that in the very next slide. This is what it looks like on a really mild day. Or rather, I took this picture in July during a record heat wave. So how wonderful that your home could be just like a shaded pavilion out in the garden. And yet there's no leaving the garden here. It's just always there for you. So you're looking at lightweight timber frame joinery structures. Here's another quote. Only a few vertical posts hold up the roof, and the space in between the posts can be left open if desired. Wide windows with low sills mean you don't have to stand up and walk over to the window to look out. Au contraire. So the Sukiya Living magazine summarizes the Sukiya Living environment style with about 6 points. Number one, more integration of interior and exterior spaces. 2, ample use of natural materials. 3, craftsmanship of the highest quality. 4, light, elegant proportions. 5, respect for the human scale. 6, a keen understanding of human sensory perception. 7, the general suggestion of quiet elegance and relaxed lifestyle. Now, this was in Sukiya Living magazine, January, February 2008. So prefiguring this Kurisu's warning, danger and opportunity crisis. So this slide will be worth revisiting in the future because it illustrates many of those 7 points. There's another point later in the same editorial. You aren't surrounded by 2 separate things, with one being the house and the other the garden. No, this is one thing, and you're sitting smack in the middle of it. This is Shiseido in Kyoto. Worth going. Quote, there are literally thousands of residential gardens for every public one. Well over 90% of the gardens in Japan are in the kancho style, which means they're small, enclosed, and viewed from inside the house. So what's important to remember here is, and we've talked about it before, there's no path through that garden. You're seated in the path. You're at a accommodation on that path. The path was, if you remember the Roji, right, the tea garden, the path led from the door you leave when you get off work, get on the bus or the train or into your car, along that road, and you disembark and you enter the enclosure of your residential sanctuary. Or maybe you're visiting a spa or a commercial spa, right? It's the commercial space, but regardless, it's your sanctuary. And if it's a residence, you'll be there a lot longer than you will be at a commercial establishment. So that's why over 90% of the gardens are developed around residences. And they're small. And they're enclosed because housing's crowded. You need to make a quiet place. You enclose it. You will see at the back of the screen, there's some taller shrubs. Probably just the other side of those is a busy street, right? It's your residence. And here we are looking at something that, you know, it could be a bank of clouds. It could be a stack of waves. And you're on the beach looking out. It could be foothills leading up to the mountains with taller shrubbery behind. These basic things like shrubs, azaleas in the foreground, probably osmanthus in the back, can be manipulated with the head shear into linear waves and into aerial cloud forms with flat bottoms, just supported by an armature of slender stems. And the effect is quite strong. You'll be amazed. All right. Now this looks familiar. There's our protagonist with a friend. Here's the quote. Sukiya Living magazine, July, August 2012. Westerners sometimes talk about indoor-outdoor living spaces. Usually that amounts to a sliding glass door and a patio or deck outside. Japan, as you sit in your living room, you already feel you are outside in your garden. And if you're outside in your garden, sitting on your engala perhaps, you already feel like you're inside your house. Here we have a person standing in the garden. Maybe they were just passing by. Maybe, you know, they're doing their garden chores. And here's someone inside, seated on the edge of the veranda. And they can interact very informally and readily, even if one of them is further back in the room. It's not unlike you're out working in your front yard and a neighbor passes on the sidewalk and hails you from there, and you stride up to your picket fence and you have a moment together. Lovely. It is also helpful if the land slopes upward as you move from the house outward. This means that the garden will be laid out like a landscape painting, and you'll be able to see everything clearly. So in a landscape painting, I'm going to interject, movement outward moves up in the picture plane. So you're hanging this picture on the wall. If the object is farther away, it's generally higher up in your screen. I'm going to take you here from foreground. This is Kohanen in Oakland again. There's a portion of the little pond. So that's ground level. I mean, that's horizon, right? Sea level. And you can see you're rising up a hill right in between these big stones. And up there at the crest of this little berm hill, there's a very large conifer tree, a coast redwood planted. And similarly, following up the berm, the higher upland you go, the bigger the rocks are, right? Less topsoil. What do we have here? A waterfall. So there's this profound feeling of moving upward here in a rather modest size composition, fairly typical of a front yard or backyard in a typical 1/10 of an acre or 20th of an acre lot even. This is a very small garden. Okay. So that's the essence of the Sukiya environment as it got developed. While we were looking at this picture, Jane, hi Jane, asked, the openings are great for the summer, but what about the winter? Brilliant question. My pleasure. So Jane, let me see. I'm going to answer your question now. I'm going to close that. So the climate in Japan is fairly cold in the winter. It's considered cold temperate, so it'd be kind of like the East Coast, New York City or something in the winter. You can get some snow on the ground, especially in olden times. Times are warming nowadays. Most of the people are settled close to the Japan Sea on the Pacific side. So that's quite a bit more mild. They're protected from the Siberian winds by the mountains. People on the west coast of Japan have it really tough. In any case, they have really hot, humid summers. I passed out my first visit, record heat wave. I couldn't take it. It caused quite a stir. And then I came to with this very worried looking docent standing over me. What should I do? Call the ambulance. Anyway, and then in the winter, like I said, it's pretty cold. So they opted for the strategy of a house that keeps you cool in the summer rather than the house that keeps you warm in the winter. The philosophy was, as I think Frank Chance explained in the aesthetics of the Japanese living environment, he did. He said it was, you heat the individual, not the house. They couldn't heat a house so that you could walk around in your pajamas. So instead, folks, bundled up, and they'd have a device called, in particular, if you were going to be stationary, like sitting at a table, you would have a footwell, and the pedestal holding up the table, or even in the space under the floor, there'd be a little hibachi. It's kind of like the thing that we grill hot dogs on. There'd be some burning charcoal coals, and it'd be enclosed in clay or iron, with a lid, and a little bit of smoke coming out, supposed to waft up through the straw roof or some other device. And you put a blanket skirt around the perimeter of the table to trap the hot air in your leg space. And you might wear a nice coat. And this would warm you, even though you'd be in frozen air. And this proved very economical approach. And it allowed for the maximization of the free passage of air through the structure in summer by having these, let's face it, loose fitting sliding walls. And also, one reason why this type of structure, you'll notice, is about 18 inches off of ground level. There's a reason for that. And the world over, people have learned if you use your architecture to cool the air with shade adjacent to the interior, air moving on the wind, passing through that shaded area will cool prior to entering your domicile. So the colonnade of mission-style Spanish architecture from the Mediterranean is a fine example of this. And the colonnade is very similar to a cloister, which is again, a roofed walk on the perimeter of a building. And then you can open doors on the side of the building and let that in. So this area of the Angawa is just under the edge of the roof, and then the wind enters right where that person's sitting and then proceeds into the interior of the structure, especially if you have linked rooms in the style. Sukiya-style in particular uses an aggregate, meaning you start out with one hut, like at Katsura. They start out with a shoin, and then they put a second hut, and a second enclosure with a shared wall overlapping like half of the wall. So on a diagonal bias, you would say they meet at the corners, and they overlap just enough for comfortable transit between the two. So you build an addition on your house, and you knock a hole in the wall so you have a passage into the new addition. And so by this additive process, you can get larger structures, and it's a good thing. You can really, no matter which side you're on, if you can open the wall, you can get the wind to go all the way through. And I want to point out that rather than putting the floor of the structure directly on the ground, where it would, of course, in the winter, it'd be too moist, you get wood rot. And in the summer, you might actually conduct heat from the soil up into your building. Who's to say if it's in the shade? Likely not. But it allows air to pass under the house in contact with that colder earth that hasn't been directly warmed by the sun. And that can cool the floor. And in particular, that sunken footwell might actually be a cold refuge in the summer. I don't know. We'll have to ask Frank Chance. So below, from the side, and possibly even above if you have vented gable ends, as many houses in the West do, the heat that builds up on the surface of the roof and radiates downward into the living space, the wind can blow that out too. So that's in a nutshell how I see the architecture of this Sukiya style and many of the previous styles. It's not just getting up out of the mud, but you can take advantage of cooling air. In the winter time, again, that having cold air blowing under your house, not so great. It's probably a lot colder than the Earth, that's protected, in a sense, insulated by the structure above. But you can always warm your body. How are you going to cool it off? They made a very strategic decision to emphasize the one over which they had no control, to optimize their environment to exert as much control as they could over that oppressive heat, which is a period of activity in most, let's face it, if you're living off the land, that's when you need to work the most, be busiest. Winter, you can really afford to bundle up and be rather stationary. Okay. On with, so we went through and we saw I think you all remember this is before my computer went haywire. This is a very common encounter, as I described. One person seated on this, approximately 18 inches is about the height of a chair. I think it's actually more like 24, and there's usually what's called a shoe removal stone, which is like a porch stoop. Just outside, the seated person might have their feet on that, and it's customary to step up into the structure if they're like, well, come have some tea or something. You don't want to eat it on the veranda, or I want to show you something on the wall, and the person could just step up on the rock, kick their shoes off while they're seated on the veranda, swing around, and stand up or walk on all fours, is whatever. Do whatever's your style. So, and we talked about how these tend to be on ever smaller lots as the population grows. Land becomes harder to afford as the other materials. Emphasis on vegetation, the most affordable form of gardening. Rocks being a lot of effort. So, and as you can see, the shrubs stacked up here and more clearly stacked up here. So there's your review. On to a larger form of enclosure. So this style of gardening is adaptable to larger spaces. This is a private residence wherein the same, materials and devices are done again on a more aristocratic scale. And this is about enclosure nevertheless. In order to achieve the illusion of being out in the wild, like our friend Tim earlier, you first have to make the city go away. So if you look into the heart of this composition, the two largest trees directly over the center of the pond, you go about halfway up, you notice there's kind of an orangey cast behind them. You can actually pick out the roof line of an adjoining house parked just over the property line, but you didn't even notice it at first glance, and that's the point. I've spent many an hour in this garden, and I'm never aware of the neighbors. And so once again, quoting Sukiya Living magazine, in Western homes, the privacy barrier of the house is the wall, meaning the house wall. In a traditional Japanese home, the privacy barrier is the enclosure that surrounds the garden. This can be a wall, a fence, a hedge, or massed shrubbery. People on the outside can't see in, and you can't see out. The result is a kind of sanctuary, a special private place that, rather than being outside, is part of your inside living environment. A private outdoor place. How many of us go to a national park, to the beach, and all we want to do is get away from the other people, right? The idea is to somehow make that doable every day. Now, this fellow had a bit of a spread. That's quite a massive undertaking, but believe it or not, that 3 or 4-story mini mansion back there is hidden by only a 20-foot band of coast redwood trees. Very effective, very narrow barrier. When I stayed in Kyoto, I was sleeping on a second floor open to the outside. I was maybe no more than 10 feet from the property line. And there was a mere 2-foot wide barrier of timber bamboo between me and this sprawling temple complex, highly urbanized. And, you know, as the brief amount of time I would spend in that room every day, I was hardly aware of it except when I heard, you know, the temple bell being rung. Very effective. In a lot of sense, it conjures up the saying, the whole point is to be able to be alone in the crowd, right? So here's a more residential scale enclosure. So what we're really doing now is breaking it down by the key. Remember those 7 key points. An enclosure is, without enclosures, very hard. Whoever wants to have tea ceremony in a median strip, right? Okay, so this is a screen of columnar arbor vitae. On the right, that is, right here. And as I recall, it's only about 5 feet deep. And if some plants you can prune, you can do that even thinner. The timber bamboo comes to mind. That's normally a rather, you know, rambunctious thing, but it was highly disciplined. Meanwhile, the low hedge in back provides privacy while incorporating some borrowed scenery for a layered depth of field. So my mouse is tracking what appears to be the roof of an outbuilding, and indeed it is. And that roof is very tasteful, low pitch, hipped roof, right? Has 4 corners rather than just being a 2-sided thing. It's a 4-sided roof. It's a 4-cornered hip combined with a tar and gravel top or something like that. So you see what's old fashioned and you don't see what's modern. And then beyond that's another bank of controlled shrubbery, and then finally trees from who knows how many lots down the way. All right. So this is a good place to stop as we've passed through what we might call traditional Sukiya. And now I really want to recall that Kurisu's prophecy was that if the tradition doesn't adapt to new circumstances and essentially remain widespread, it's in danger of, you know, fizzling. So floundering, he said. So there's something now called modern Sukiya, which has arisen really in the 20th century. Now that Japan has a lot of contact with the rest of the world. I grew up with my neighbor next door. My neighbors had a son named Matthew, and he became a carpenter here in the United States. And lo and behold, had to move to Japan and got a job over there as a carpenter, building things that look somewhat like, this is a little grand here. This is a rather high class joint, but building 2-by, stick style building, no longer timber frame, kind of modern ranch or whatever type houses that are actually Sukiya style, only not with a timber frame. So this style, modern Sukiya, I'm going to quote, Includes conveniences such as indoor plumbing, glass windows, heating systems, and expanded storage space for futons and clothing. So, Jane, look at this building. This is an insulated building. They have building codes now. They want you to insulate your home, and they want you to air condition it in the summer. I mean, for your own sake. So how are you going to have these conveniences of modern life and this energy efficiency and this greater degree of climate control while still holding on to the virtues of the earlier Sukiya-style? Well, Sukiya Living Magazine, September, October 2012, goes on to say, in terms of interior appearance, the old and new styles can be fairly similar. This is particularly true in the home's main living room, known as the shiki in Japanese. Elsewhere in the house, there are many structural differences worth noting. For example, Kindai Sukiya, that's modern Sukiya, homes are built on partial concrete foundations and are usually somewhat insulated. They tend to feature wall systems that do not expose the timbers on the outside of the house. Indeed, there may be no timbers, yes? If they're 2x4 stick construction, it all has to be sheet. Okay, back to the quote. And their Engawa feature a third layer, sliding glass doors, to go along with the traditional shoji, that's paper, shoji doors and wooden shutters. Most of these developments are designed to create a more comfortable living environment, but some are in response to tighter building and zoning codes. Okay, so society at large, as expressed through the authorities, is trying to look out for our best interests as a collective in terms of energy conservation and whatnot. And individuals, of course, want a more comfortable and economical environment as well. So, so far, Japanese have not stormed the Diet Parliament building yet. Okay. So, the more typical Japanese suburban house, I'm actually going to share my screen here for a second. It's going to be a bit amateur. Okay, let's see. New share. Basic. No. Video. Yes. Okay, sorry. There you have it. Now that little house could be anywhere, but what you're seeing is the low-pitched and up here, four-sided hipped roof, which is also common in other countries. Here is a gabled roof over the front entry right there. My pencil doesn't do it justice, but there are sliding glass doors foot to ceiling, mostly in this area here, and so forth. Share portion of screen. Share. All right, we're back. No, we're not. I'm so sorry. Jeff Harris raised a hand. Yes, Jeff. Oh, there you are. Allowed to talk. Jeff, where'd you go? Okay, Jeff, you're allowed to talk.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now, Jeff. What are you looking at? What's on the screen?
Sorry, Peter. I was just trying to, I was just trying to let you know what I was looking at on the screen.
Yeah, what are you seeing?
I'm seeing the apartment with the concrete rail and the bamboo lattice.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to leave your mic hot, and also Roger's and Sonia's, and a few other folks. Oh, there's Timothy Hanskin. I'm going to put him up, and Vincent Cololo. Okay, great. So we've got some wonderful heavyweights, and you guys, all you have to do is unmute yourselves, Tim and Jeff and Roger and Vincent, and I'm going to proceed here. And you can mute yourself, but you can use your space bar or your mouse to chip in here. I really, I miss you guys. I love the dialogue, and let the show resume. So any comments so far on the evolution of the style, its culmination in Sukiya, and we're about to plunge into the future here now. So this would be a good point for Q&A and for our panel just assembled to weigh in. So there are no questions, so I welcome comments. Yes? All right. You're all being very quiet, except for someone who's whistling or something. Okay.
Peter, I'd just like to say, can you hear me?
Yes, Timothy Hanskin, you are on.
I would just like to say that culture is always a bottom-up kind of thing, whether it's the gladiators in Rome, or whether it's the prostitutes in and subcultures in the demi-monde and in Japan, or whether it's the poor gardeners or the carpenters. They're the ones inventing things. They're the ones that came up with these styles. And those are the people who are the unsung heroes of Japanese culture. It isn't really the daimyo. The daimyo came up, the lords and ladies, they came up with the highfalutin stuff that the commoners never saw. And it was the commoners who came up with the culture that we look upon as Japanese culture today. End of comment.
Fantastic.
So when we talk about hip hop or rap in the United States or jazz, these all came up from the put down subcultures, and all the commoners in Japan for hundreds of years were the underclass.
That's right. We're all feeling the squeeze these days. I have a feeling they want to take us back to the robber barons and then the rest of us who, child labor and working in the mines.
A feeling. We've been in the robber baron class again for the last 10, 15 years.
All right, heavy in the editorial content today. Yes. So, stay with us as we figure out how we can take the fruits of these innovations and not have them lost, like Hoichi pointed out in the beginning, or rather we're going to get to momentarily. There is a crisis. A lot of the benefits of sliding glass doors and proximate gardens are becoming increasingly inaccessible, at least on the individual scale. And who wants to have to pay admission to enjoy these kinds of things when we all know there's enough wealth, at least in the United States, there's enough wealth generated every year in gross receipts for every man, woman, and child to have a $50,000 a year, stipend. So come on, Anyway, enough. So we've seen how it was done up to the point of modern times, and I just showed a sketch of a kind of a typical suburban home. It's a middle class home, but it has a lot of the features of the best of modern conveniences, and still maybe enough of a lot size to have a nice view garden outside of a large window or open wall. Now it gets tougher. Here's the apartment I stayed in Fukuoka. This is a small lot where there's room, just enough room to park two vehicles, one stacked on top of the other. I'm telling you, it's pretty funny. It's like everyone having to have a long, whatever they call those taquasinas, the car haulers, in their own yard. And here is an attempt using entirely modern materials. This is a concrete, reinforced concrete, 2 or 3 story apartment. And here they have some attempt at a engawa. And here's one of those hanging screens. I don't know, it's called a biobo or what it's called, you know, for climate control. And the interior of the apartments is very nice. It's lots of wood grain showing, very polished surfaces. So it's trying to be refined Sukiya, but there's no question there's not much room for a garden here. And we were going to get to that kind of garden a little later in the piece. So here's that museum piece, and that's what we're worried about, that this kind of living is going to become a thing of the past. And as we move into the future, when it's reinforced concrete, it's kind of, at least from the outside, it's kind of hard to recognize it. And my initial reaction was to recoil. It looked like frankly, like a brutalist cube, right? It was only when I spent time on the interior of that building, it had all the usual features, you know, a very nice ashiki, you know, it had all the interior stuff. You can still have your bright sunny window over a desk and so forth. Fascinating. So here's another quote. As the Sukiya style evolves, it is particularly useful to categorize it as a mood rather than as a collection of stylistic devices. If, on the other hand, the Sukiya style is defined by specific physical characteristics, it becomes largely stagnant. Couple that narrow approach with extremely high costs and a lack of suitably trained craftsmen, and the Sukiya style becomes largely extinct. A historical style rather than a living form. Once again, Sukiya Living Magazine. Ouch! In today's Japan, the most serious hurdle facing Sukiya Zakuri is probably not the cost, nor the declining number of Sukiya carpenters. Upper-class Japanese families have always been able to overcome those obstacles. A more fundamental problem might be elbow room, the lack of residential building space along the country's main train corridors. July, August 2012. So I guess that made the point. Without, finishing up the quote, without adequately sized building lots and the garden space they provide, the Sukiya style residence tends to lose its graceful, airy feeling. And here is a shot of that graceful, airy feeling. Quote, it's a style that suits the one-story family home with gardens all around, not an apartment or a townhouse. Gulp. So this is a private residence I had the pleasure of visiting, and I was one of the last people to tread through it as it was being sold and scheduled for demolition, and they were definitely going to put a condo tower up right here. This was in the Yashiya suburb of Osaka, and that's a very high rent zip code. and the land values are such. And what a shame. Look at that. All the more, there's a little backstory here. I was taken here by a friend who's kind of a industrial daimyo kind of guy. And when I said, oh, what a charming, lovely house, he said, yeah, pity, they're going to demolish it. And I said, oh, that's really too bad. You know, the world would do better if more of us had homes like this. And he said, I could pack it up and ship it to you. And guess what? We've since learned that you try and build one of these things in the United States, as our presenter Jay Van Arsdale, the wood joinery carpenter, explained, they'll make you slap so many extra sheets of plywood and metal fasteners on it, it'll just entirely lose its character. It wouldn't, not eatable, right? On and on. Oh, here's another quote. Many people, including young Japanese people, are interested in creating Sukiya living environments. And nowadays, they're starting to pioneer many new versions of it. You needn't be concerned about doing things perfectly or in the Japanese way, but rather you should strive to create a relaxed and beautiful living environment. That'll hold your tongue. You can scarcely contain your consternation, I know. From Katsura on, this was always the goal, and still is, July, August 2012. So what you're looking at here is a one of those container houses. This is a thing that it's the size of a small trailer box, you know, like an RV, and quite an interesting experiment in having a Sukiya-style integrated living environment on a rather small scale. So for those of you who aren't living in the big bad city, there's a whole village of these things in 2 different locations within 2 miles of my house. So it's coming. Comments, crew? Okay. So now Sukiya Living Magazine, which really is supplying the narrative backbone of this particular presentation, goes on to say, quote, under the flexible rules of Kindai Sukiya, modern Sukiya, right? Capturing that feeling is not as difficult as it might seem. And some Western home styles are particularly suited for such an extension. For example, a typical 1950s suburban ranch offers the chance to use windows and sliding doors to integrate nearly every room with the garden outside. And here's a ranch style home, rather deluxe, with some floor to ceiling windows. So he's not saying that this is necessarily something to brag about, but you can see there's potential compatibility here. And this is a ranch home making no attempt. It's just attempting to be a ranch home. I wonder how many of those windows are fixed versus sliding. You know, not that it matters. Although I like to feel the wind on my face and hear the splash of, you know, fish in the pond or the flutter of a bird's wing. You can be washing dishes and you hear one of those things and boom, you reconnect with the outdoor environment, albeit briefly. And if that goes on all day long, it's really a sweet experience. Okay, so the quote goes on, the shingle style, not to mention the modern timber frame, pay homage to the use of natural materials in the home environment. This is not a home. This is the Asilomar Conference Center. Thank you, Julia Morgan. There's room for improvement in every presentation. Arts and crafts inspired homes, such as the turn of the century bungalows, display joinery and metalwork and other craftsmanship that, while not as delicate as the Sukiya style, is still noteworthy. So this is actually an 1800s craftsman, literally a Sears craftsman. This is a kit home they would ship out on a railroad car. This is in Missoula, Montana. But very, very similar to the sort of green and green style bungalows that really took hold in California starting in the 1920s, and feature a rather short porch, and and a lot of beautiful interior work, as he mentioned. And even the common 1.5-story Cape Cod with its smaller upstairs bedrooms shows a sensibility towards the human scale that contemporary Mac mansions could learn from. All right, so this is a comfortably large home here, rather common in a prosperous suburb. This sensitivity to the human scale, you'll notice it features a nice ample front porch. It's analogous to an Engawa, although you have to go through the front door to pass in and out of the house, which is extremely restrictive, honestly. All you have to do is get some shoes you can take on and off easily, and every one of those windows could be a sliding one, right? And sensitivity to the scale, it might be mentioned that ceiling height has a lot to do with that. High ceiling is certainly appropriate for public buildings where dense spacing of the crowd on the floor can create panic and claustrophobia, unless you have that openness up above that really calms you. So that symphony halls are built that way for a reason, I think. It's not just grandeur to impress you like a cathedral, it's to relax you. So in the case of a residence, that's simply impractical and impossible to heat. Or at least now that we have radiant floor heating, who knows? And if you've ever been in a Cape Cod, the upstairs bedrooms, they're not for rambling around. There's not a lot of headroom, and they're small, very efficient, and therefore it should be more affordable and therefore more widespread. Okay, now we're back to Japan dealing with some of these same constraints, 100 or 200 years ago. In the urban area, be it Tokyo or Kyoto before it, these are very modern cities. They grappled with these issues in various ways. I'm sure there were tenements, and they're all torn down now, but you can still find these numbers, and this is what we might call a townhouse. You share 2 walls with your neighbors, and you have a narrow frontage on the street, that's bottom left here, and then you might have a bit of a backyard, which later became developed with this storage unit in the rear. But here's your backyard there. And as folks have pointed out similarly, this is actually quote unquote, outside the house here. This is like a side passage, but it has a kitchen in it. So you've got a roof, but it's well vented. And those of you who've seen this before, you'll know you typically can be a 2-story number. And here you see the 2nd story up here. You would have just living quarters up above, perhaps, or not. As a 1-story number, you'd have living quarters back in the back half. In the front half, typical merchant thing, you'd have windows displaying your wares, public entry, take off your shoes while seated on here, hop up through here, through this door. Now you're into the kind of the main laden, right, where you buy and sell and exchange. And you also have a view into the central atrium garden right there. And then the atrium garden also opens up onto this living space. It could be a living room, unlikely to be a bedroom, and so forth. In the 2-story number, the bedrooms would all be upstairs because during the day, who wants to commute up and downstairs? And so forth. And the air movement is difficult in these, to say the least. I've been in one in Kyoto in the summer. Visited a friend who lives there, and let's have no illusions about it. The Sukiya single-family detached residence is superior for summer climate control. But here's an atrium garden, and if you can get some air movement hot air up and out, you're going to draw colder air in from somewhere else. Could be in through the Subo garden. Subo means essentially acupuncture point. You know what I mean? It's an all-purpose word. And air moving in from the hot outdoors and the neighbors' roofs comes through this irrigated amount of green foliage. It's going to be cooled and then hopefully sucked indoors as the heat of the indoors is vented out through a roof or somewhere else high, passive airflow. All right, enough of that. I think the beautiful key is that the garden is shared because it's atrium and every room around surrounding it has opens to it. And that was sort of the condition at the apartment building I stayed in Fukuoka. There was an atrium garden, and some of the plants were taller, reaching up, sending boughs of the trees up to grace the upper stories. And this, I'm going to go back to it. This is on the second floor here, I believe. And that's where the family I was staying with lived, and then I slept in the basement, so to speak, the ground level. Okay. So here's an example of employing Fusé in such a tiny atrium garden. This is your typical sort of leftover space in the additive sprawl of a temple complex. And people commute around here on the Engawa, you can see in the upper left corner. Give you more of the picture. And just ever so briefly, they get a view of what amounts to a lighthouse on a peninsula on the coast. And you are thinking of your vacation in Mendocino or Maine or Cape Cod. Get the drift, yuck, yuck. So here's a second floor Subo garden on the left. I'm about to have tea ceremony in a two-story machiya with the Mori family. And here's another one of those temple remnants. Interesting, very similar in the San Francisco Bay Area in the nearby town of Fremont along the main train corridor. People are getting housing developments of their own individual sort of craftsman-esque stucco single-family home about 5 feet from the next craftsman stucco single-family home. The walls don't adjoin, so it's a little quieter. Get a bit of fresh air in between, and you have remnant strips like this that call for one or two simple gestures of suggestion, not an elaborate layout like some of these stroll gardens and so forth, like a whole city park, right? Okay, so here's the two-story machiya, like the one in Fukuoka. The Monti room would be on the second floor, upper left corner. That's right up here. And the so to speak, the Rojis, this hallway on the left here, you'd go through there and sort of loop around into the tea room. That's what we did. Something like that journey. And here you are in the tea room, and you can see this is a modern Kindai Sakuri structure as well. A lot of Fukuoka got bombed, but they rebuilt. So there's the atrium there with the sliding glass doors, very modern. Here's the sliding, or that's a fixed partition. I'm sorry, I forget. So the garden functions as a Roji contemplation. You enter it with your mind. And the room here, corresponds to the front of a one-story machiya. That is, if you're coming here for tea ceremony, this is your gathering hall. And downstairs is where they'll sell you pots and pans and tea. On to that aristocratic stuff, Tim Hanskin. This is as aristocratic as it gets. This is massive in scale. This is out in the country. How many farmers and foresters were displaced so that this, vacation home could be developed? But I want to point out, that, again, the similarity of this to any classy city central park, where commoners like Tim and me pool our resources, pay our taxes, and designate leaders to develop something. And this is very reminiscent of Lakeside Park in Oakland, California, which is a peninsula of land set in a body of water created by damming a wetland and backed by distant hills. And one can have an experience somewhat like this, a spacious experience, if we act collectively, versus slitting each other's throats so that we can steal enough from one another to have it all to ourselves. So just again, a nod to the parallel tradition of the time. Here's the English aristocracy displacing farmers to produce these massive stroll gardens with various cute allusions to other places like the dome in the distance. It was, you know, some kind of classical era Rome or Greece. So a little quote: the emerging romantic movement, right? Japan, England, what's the difference? Produced poetry and paintings which extolled the beauties of nature and landscape. The Grand Tour, that's a European phenomenon, which all cultured Englishmen made through the Alps to Italy, brought them into contact with rugged, picturesque scenery. Well, don't we love the woodblock prints from the few artists who were allowed to travel in Edo era Japan, and they saw the scenic wonders of Japan, and they sketched them, and they brought them back to the capital, and of course they'd touch off another fashion craze. Everyone would remodel their backyards or their sprawling whatever holdings, and to capture this new wonder that had been brought to their attention. And you know, again, we can do this collectively. So back to Katsura, which really, you know, is kind of like the main role model. And here's the famous sandbar spit dotted with pine trees at the mouth of a big old river somewhere in central Japan. And there's another one in Kyushu, which, you know, which Leanne Higashiyuchi Scott and I went to in company with our friends in Fukuoka. So scenes such as they would see on the tour were represented on the canvases of Nicolas Poussin, Salvador Rosa, and Claude Lorraine. The paintings were not actual views, but compositions of typical elements selected and arranged for emphasis. Craggy mountains, rivers, pastoral plains, ruined castles and monuments, lakes and windblown trees. In other words, it's an idealization. It's an edited medley of the greatest hits of Mother Nature. Whether it's in England or it's in Japan, that's the idea. So if you're a sketch artist, you're used to omitting the phone poles and the other noise and glorifying the real essence of the scene. This is not about, you know, Mama, is there really a Santa Claus here? This is about your imagination. So here's another print. This is a sand sprinkle painting I encountered in the tunnel underneath Kyoto in the subway station. This is the sand spit dotted with pine trees. And if you zoom your screen, you can see those are pine trees, that pattern that recedes into the distance in an ever more simplified way. Lovely rendering, distant hills, etc. You can do this in a garden, is what they're saying. A lot of detail in the foreground, and then it can get more and more gestural and simplified towards the rear. Detail, pattern, recognizable tree pattern, and in the distance, it's just tones, white for the clouds or the hills, you know, and this could be the evening sky, the last glimmer of light, and then the black, of course, is the body of water. Lovely. All doable in a garden. So here's a stroll garden at a temple where it's art imitating art. They have a huge bridge over a gorge, and they just couldn't resist doing a little reprise as you're on your way out, and this is on the trail out. Kind of cute. And there's the real thing of higher up. So this is that Tofukuji. Let's see. Oh yeah. Okay, so another feature of these famous stroll gardens, I'm going to make it bigger, is the hide and reveal, the control of the scene. I love this story. I read in the Tribe and Herman's Guide to the Gardens of Kyoto all about the great imperial garden at Shukaku-in and how you travel up the hillside in a tunnel of foliage, a dense hedge. You know, you can't see over, you have no idea where you're going till you emerge at the top. And you see the whole view from, you know, and you're up at the Hermitage, right? And so it's like being blindfolded and being led to a new and delightful place. Of course, the only problem was it was built by Japanese gardeners in the Middle Ages, all under 5 feet tall, and I'm over 6, so I could. The illusion was lost on me. It was funny. The joke was on me. So here's recreating a scene from poetry, the many planked bridge. This is again at a big imperial garden. You know, but the admission price is incredibly cheap. They get a tax exempt status if they open the former estates to the public. So they're de facto public-private, or mostly essentially privatized public parks. Very interesting model. I'm not sure I'm in favor of it. Lastly, this was so much fun talking about with last time. Vincent Covolo asked this incredibly powerful question. What's so hot about the Adachi Art Museum? And we made the case that, you know, all the trouble to visit this place, it's far out of the way, that as you travel along the path through the museum building, and you know, your every movement is controlled. The hallway turns to the left now, turns to the right, and strategically placed windows give you the prime edited views of the whole garden rather than the whole thing. And intermittently paintings somewhat related are hung, that this was an attempt at a stroll garden from inside the building, a novel wrinkle on the Sukiya concept of permeability between the under roof and out of doors living environment. And the applicable quote, once again, all these English landscape garden quotes being from the dearly departed Berkeley professor Michael Laurie. He says, the English landscape garden was a product of the Romantic movement. Its form was based on direct observation of nature and the principles of painting. Surprise, variety, and concealment, and the development of idyllic prospects. Right? Surprise, get to the top of the hill at Shukaku-in. Variety, you know, there's lots to look at, right? This guy's got a big budget. And concealment, the hedge, right? Or the framed views, the concealment of what you do and do not see at Adachi. And the development of idyllic prospects became the goals of the art of landscape, the manipulation of nature's undulating contours, and the articulation of light and shade, much as the painter would do, became the preoccupation of all men of taste and culture. So here we have a prosperous industrialist building an art museum that's open to the public, pay admission, and you're not allowed to walk out there and tromp around. And indeed, the way it's arranged, it's supposed to be most interesting from the views provided. So in a sense, you're not a pioneer frontiersman making an original discovery. You're on a well-curated tour So this is very modern. This was what, built in the 60s, gang? Or even
70.
1970. There you go.
I think it opened in 70.
And like, I want to harken back to our opening garden slide of the Heian, the aristocratic complex. I don't dare scroll up to it because we all know what happened 15 minutes ago. But Mr. Adachi, we're talking a guy who left the farm and went to the city and became some kind of industrial manufacturer and has a large payroll and guaranteed. We all remember those images from the 70s and 80s when we were supposed to get more competitive like the Japanese. And you see all the workers out there doing their morning warm-ups and singing the college fight song or whatever, right? They're building team spirit to go in there and produce those cars as fast as they possibly can, and sell them to us and whatnot. Every morning at Adachi, everyone from the doorman to the secretarial staff, bookkeepers, they all gather together and then go out in the garden and they pluck little weeds before they ever have a chance to get big. And that's why that place looks pristine, right? They have this moment of solidarity. We're all in this together. We're all going to do the most tedious of the chores. And in a sense, considered by many, the most accessible, doesn't require skilled training. But we're all in it together and we get to know each other. And then we go our separate ways back to our typewriters or up our ladders, as the case may be. And it shows this is a matter of opinion, but there is something to be said for group endeavor versus consumption in private, whether it's eating or enjoying the fruits of culture. And this is why this wonderful tradition of public gardens, which probably, in any case, in the United States, is really came to the fore with the development of Central Park in the 1800s. Think of it, a crowded city full of tenements, no Suboniwa gardens, no nothing, right? Sweltering heat, no windows. People got to be out in public as they still do today in the densest inner city. Make accommodation and have an experience of where you can all meet. I volunteer in the main public garden in the city of Oakland. It's a very democratic place. I meet all kinds of people there. And it's good for me and it's good for them. All right, a little bit more about the Adachi Art Museum. Here's that shot of Katsura I'd mentioned. On the right is the oldest building. Then they added the next one. So the oldest one is said to be more of a showing in character. And then it starts to transition over here. And then the older one gets rebuilt and whatever. It all starts to march left to right and then start over again with the rebuilding and become ever more Sukiya in character. And I want to show you again that there's no more than about a 25% overlap at a given corner. So that 25% max and often a little less of your floor space might be considered shared by that rectangular gesture of each pavilion. And this is not unlike if you have the good fortune to visit, other aggregate building places like, Taos Pueblo is not exactly the same as overlapping, but it is additive. You would be building an additional room on the roof of the previous one, and you all start to share walls and entries. Anyway, lovely, but the diagonal movement is exactly the same as at the Adachi. And so a number of different views could be uniquely experienced depending on the time of day and where you were at. And so rather than having it all at once and greatly simplifying it so that it's just one static composition, like, a statue of so-and-so, you have the morning garden, the noon garden, the evening garden, right? and each of them possibly corresponding to the kind of room that, you'd be occupying at that time. So controlling movement, frames views from the connected pavilions here and at the Adachi Museum. So, and you'll see this diagonal movement in the way that trees are trained and rocks are placed, and architecture is either viewed or screened along a strolling path circulation as well. So there's I think for our larger collective spaces, there's lots to be learned even from this large-scale private residence and the others of Japan, which are, in today's real estate market, we're not going to see too many more of those, but it's all okay. So it's been great getting together with you all to learn about the Japanese style living environment. We're not done yet. And Ken will be pleased to see this slide. There's lots to go from here. I'm pleased to announce that there's a new publication in the works, detailed in the second line here, and that is there'll be a compilation of articles, on the theme of the Sukiya-style living environment as an integrated article. Forthcoming, possibly by the end of January, and you would be able to check on that status by looking up the Sukiya Living magazine on the internet or somewhere else, and I'm sure once it's compiled, it'll be announced there in the little ad section in the rear, if not introduced with an editorial. And for sake of others, you just can't beat the following the development of these things in the magazine itself, because the format of the magazine is to, in the context of the overall environment, select a particular item that, well executed, can realize, the greater integrated goal. So you could literally have a dozen or more articles just on building Nobudan pathways, all of them authored by Mr. Timothy Hanskin, who's with us today, who's been typecast, but is indeed a much more broad-based individual. and so forth, rocks, plants, carpentry, fish in water, the works, almost anything. And if you're looking for something and you don't find it there, you ought to write the editor, because they probably just overlooked it. And then they'll go and hunt down some people to write about it. Just wonderful, a very open platform that way, all in bite-sized pieces. Whereas the third line, the classic tradition in Japanese architecture, modern versions of the Sukiya-style. This is a tome. And if you ever see it at a rummage sale, grab it. It's out of print. And the author, Mr. Teiji Aito, is a great authority. And this book, supposedly, Tim, help me out here, treats upon carrying the Sukiya-style forward into the 20th century. Yeah, there you go. So that is the exciting prospect, because that's where we find ourselves. So I can't wait to read it. And I'm sure that it has many lessons to offer. Now, Japanese homes and their surroundings is a snapshot from the 1800s. Its major blessing, besides being well written and very nicely illustrated, pen and ink, is that it's available to you immediately. It's a free PDF on the internet.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, the copyright is long gone. So you can browse images, or you can actually get the entire text. And it's also been republished as a book, which I purchased, very affordable, sort of academic paperback size. And many people love that book. And I'm sure it goes into great detail about the Edo era pinnacle of the traditional style. And then lastly, I have to give a nod to Mark Peter Keene's Japanese Garden Design, which together with Sukiya Living magazine really provided the narrative frame for this presentation. His chronological progression and exploration of the connections between different eras is first rate. So this is an important time, an opportune time to kick off any kinds of unfinished issues, to go back and revisit any slides. We have gone way over, and many people have checked out. That's because we threw in all that bonus material of large scale stuff. But for those who remain, fire away.
Peter, this is Tim. I'd just like to say that Japanese Homes and Its Surroundings is just an amazing book. The man was a master draftsman, and he had the ability and the depth of knowledge, because he was able to go to all these homes and sit there and view them, describe them from all sorts of different angles. And it's in that book that I was just perusing the other day, the last time you were talking, that he's going all over Japan, and he's describing all sorts of different styles of homes other than Sukiya-style architecture, merchant houses and storehouses and whatnot. It's an amazing book, an amazing tome.
Encyclopedic, in other words. Wow, what a fantastic recommendation.
Yeah.
Okay, Susan, welcome.
Hi, I would just like to have you review just quickly just the 7 principles, the names of each of those. I can follow them up.
Oh, yes.
But
Okay, let's be careful. Are we gonna find that here? No. Oh yeah. Okay, Susan. Anyone who's able at the keyboard could type these up and put them in the chat. Oddly, I don't have access to chat. Okay, number 1, more integration of interior and exterior spaces. So this was compared to the other styles. 2, so number 1, more integration of interior and exterior spaces. 2, ample use of natural materials. So that it's all just planed wood. 3, craftsmanship of the highest quality. So to make it, Susan, to make it elegant, the wood posts or shelves and so forth, it's really straight out of the presentation Jay Van Arsdale gave, where a very sharp plane literally leaves a shiny, oily, smooth, glimmering, wood surface that you love to touch without having to apply varnish or varathane, and certainly smoother than sandpaper. And okay, light, elegant proportions. Look at this picture. Look at those posts holding up that roof. They don't block your view, and the whole thing feels, I feel safe underneath it. I don't feel like I'm about to be crushed like I did in the concrete apartment. That made me nervous. Okay, I'm giving you lots of time to scroll this down. 5, respect for the human scale. So here we have all around the world, people pay attention to ceiling height, for example. And I talked about that earlier. In crowded public places, high ceilings, good. If you're having a one-on-one meeting with your boss, intimidating, right? I'd rather meet with my boss after crawling through the opening in the tea room, and we're we're both kind of sitting cross-legged and left our swords at the door. I'd feel more at ease. It's like meeting him at the bar. right? Or the restaurant or something. So a noodle shop. All right, number 6. Also keen for human scale, there's actually quite a lot going on in this composition where how far back you set the midground and then the background in an enclosed, say, single family home lot. You might have a perimeter hedge, but inside that you might have some trees that evoke the mountains on top of that little hill you might build from digging out your pond. And if those trees are too high, you're only looking at the bottom of them. And it doesn't, it no longer is a whole composition. You're just really close to the edge of some big old forest. But if you can have a grove of trees out there, which your eye can capture as a whole, suddenly you're looking at an entire scene as if you were on a cloud or in an airplane, or even standing back a bit from it. You can pack more of a punch. That's what I'm saying. You can have the Sea of Japan, and you can have the hills, and you can have the peak. You can have the volcano at the back corner. If you tried to build a life-size volcano, that wouldn't be much of a garden. You couldn't even fit it. I think I'm pummeling it into, too much. So human scale usually is that at about 20-foot depth from the house, you might fit a 15-foot tree, and without bending your neck, just wheeling around as you're carrying an article from this side to that, you can look out this, say, 8-foot opening in your wall, and you can see the top of your tree and the bottom of it, which is equally interesting. You can even see the foreground where the pond, or in this case, the white gravel is. You capture the whole scene, which is ultimately more complex, gives your eye more to explore, and yeah, most folks find it more satisfying. Okay, that was number 5, human scale. Oh, so by the way, even in a municipal park, a main pathway is going to be, 12 feet wide, so that groups of people can pass one another without having to negotiate who goes first. But then if you go off into a little clearing with a picnic table, that path's going to narrow down, so it's more intimate. And the branches of the trees over the roads out in public, they're quite high to admit large trucks, lorries, whatever you call them. And inside the park, they might come down. The main paths, they might be 12 feet up. But when you go to that little enclosure with the picnic table or the overlook by the pond, you want to get close with someone. It's like going to that tea room or going to that noodle shop for conversation. That ceiling level is going to drop to 7 or 8. And so too, when you enter from the street of your home, the street trees, high browse line. By the time you're walking under the trees and into the clearing where your home, your dwelling is, you're about to go under the roof. You want to pass under 7 to 8 feet. About 8 feet feels really good. And you can get an up close look at the delicate arrangement of the leaves of the maple on the lowest branch. They're usually quite a sparse branch there. And their pattern is amazing there, and or an a close look, in other words. So that all that is on the horizontal as well as the vertical plane. That's what they're driving at there. This is so much fun to work in one of these environments and develop the ability to recognize what's at play and how you should foster it to its best. Okay, number 7 and final, the general suggestion of quiet elegance and relaxed lifestyle. So notice it's not too prescriptive. It doesn't say Japanese black pines and this and that. It's like if you're in the Caribbean, it might be, banana trees and mangoes. Who's to say? All right. Great question, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was great.
Okay. So it's been quite a while here, and I'm picking some other people up here. Steve Kraft is actually a furniture maker, cabinetry extraordinaire, and apprenticed in Japan. And Sibylla Draya lived in Japan, worked as a beekeeper. And let's see who else we can find here. Of course, is Hiromi, who I want to give us on the exit a little bit more info about the initiative and so forth. So now I've enlivened quite a few more mics. Anyone have anything to add? No? Jeff, one of these days, Jeff Harris, I want to hear about how you and your colleagues pull it off over there in the Appalachians. So
I'm sorry, how you want to hear about how what?
how you execute these kind of Sukiya-style living environments in the course of your work, because
I have an MO. I make people rip out parts of their house.
wow.
I've actually I've had 3 clients now that I can think of off the top of my head that now how they have what I would call a proper Ngawa, at least on part of their house. Yeah, I hate to be a kind of all or nothing type hardhead when I deal with clients, but sometimes I just feel like I know better than what they have in mind, because what they have in mind is informed by, often what developers do. But, if it's a higher end client, they have, really nice architecture, but it's in our Western style. And if they have the means to do it and their layout of their land is appropriate, I suggest it. And I've had a few people go with my suggestions, and they love it. And it really does kind of feel like you're in an actual Japanese niwa in Japan. That's one way. I often talk people out of spending their money on the front yard and using it in the back. Of course, we're very hilly and slopey here, so you either have the good luck of having the uphill slope in the back or you don't. But that's how I approach it. Masashi, I think, is he's probably more easygoing and more Taoist in his approach of like not forcing things.
Everyone, this is Jeff's colleague, Masashi Oshita, who also lives near Asheville, North Carolina, as does Jeff.
Yeah, and he tends to kind of go back and forth with what people think they want, and he's happy to do it in between. He does what he claims that he can't build a Japanese garden in the United States because of you have to have the Japanese people's expectation to have a real Japanese garden. I don't know if I completely agree with that, but he does what he calls Japalachian gardening. So it really is. And it's interesting because here in the Appalachians, we have a very, very similar topography and climate to Honshu. And we have a lot of the same plants that just grow naturally, natively. And so, a lot of times you could see one of Masashi's gardens and just not realize that you're not looking at natural Appalachian topography. He built what looks like a natural mountainside on fill dirt that the builders put there. But my approach is a little more heavy-handed, I think, in trying to guide people closer to the whole Sukiya. The integration of indoors and outdoors is really one of my main goals. When I go to meet a new client, if they're, I look at their property, and if there's any opportunities for doing that, even if it means altering part of the architecture, I often try to talk them into it, and invariably they're happy they did it afterwards.
Once upon a time, I worked with a remodeling contractor. So here we are regarding my favorite photo here of of the man seated on the Ngawa looking at the garden. And if this was one of the homes I'd worked in, and Jeff Harris had been there and somehow convinced the homeowner to go for this look, we would have propped up the roof, knocked out the wall, called in a welder who would have welded, steel beams to do what joinery carpentry is doing here. All right, now I know better. I would call Jay Van Arsdale, but and opened up the whole side of the house. Whereas before they met Jeff, they would have said, well, I have this lovely house and I have this nice garden out back, but I barely interact with it. I got these tiny little windows, right? Just, 10% of the surface we're looking at here, right? And he says, so I was looking through the magazine and I see people are building outdoor patios and decks. And so that person would have called up someone like us to build a patio or deck where the garden foreground is now. And the rationale might have been, well, that's a very empty foreground anyway. Who cares? It's just a pile of gravel out there, But with imagination, it's the plain and the valley before the foothills, before the mountains, or it's the sea before, the hilly island or something, right? So, and then what you would have had is a deck out there with shrubs and stuff massed so close to the deck that they would lose their compositional context. So rather than seeing the whole garden as you do now as some kind of interesting integrated topography, right, writ small, or this large snake, millipede or whatever, snaking through your yard, or let your mind free associate is the part of the play and fun of this. You'd just be looking like, well, I've got all these azaleas jammed right up against the deck, whoopee. And instead, by knocking out the wall, ding, there's your deck. And your deck and your house, they're one and the same, and your deck already has a roof over it. That's the ingenuity of this. Well, anyway, I go on. And it wouldn't have been cheap. Yes, sir.
Peter, you know what's cheaper, and I've done this, or I've had people do it a couple of times. I don't actually do the structure work, but when there is an existing deck, they often have rails around them, and they're often, at least here, if it's no higher than 30 inches off the ground, you don't have to have a rail. So I have them, or I do this part of it. We tear the rails off of the deck, and they have someone come in and build a roof over it that looks so much like Gisendo here. So that's a much easier way if you run into someone who has a deck, and the proportions of the garden, the foreground, like you were talking about, are proper to where the deck is right now. Build a roof over it, and then integrate that now roofed space with the interior of the house better. Have it actually be a room of the house. That's much easier to accomplish a lot of times than tearing out walls.
Yeah, it becomes essentially a large, called in Japan an azumaya, called in the West as a gazebo. And that's a real plus. And it if it's just to play devil's advocate, or rather to advocate the opposite, one of the genius of this particular slide of Shisendo is that being the main house, you're close to all the other items and comforts you might have the impulse, versus like being camping out at the other end of the garden in the shed. It's a kind of thing where you can be preparing the evening meal and you're looking out that wall all at the same time. Well, you keep your eyes on the knife, of course, but you could be sitting at a desk, typing a letter, and you can just look up and wow, versus having to cart all that stuff out to the gazebo and then cart it all back. I notice here in the West where people do go gaga over outdoor rooms and satellite building projects, that unless they can leave the accoutrement out there, you know, I've got all-weather cushions and a outdoor camp stove to warm my tea and this and that, and you know, but it tends to be a more specialized experience. The beauty of this notion that it's all a setting for ordinary family life is you have this multi-purpose structure that takes the role of the gazebo. It's a house and a gazebo all in one. So in an ideal world, that'd be the way to go. In a retrofit world, you're gonna do is what you can and enjoy progress. Don't get hung up on perfection. I mean, I dig that. So it's kind of fun to spar with Jeff here on this, so, for the benefit of all. So anyone raise their hands or put in a Q of A, or shall we shut this down now? Ken says, thanks for the listing of the books, etc. They look interesting. All right. Well, on the way out, I would like to hear from, first of all, we're gonna have to thank everyone involved and ask Hiromi to elaborate on the two new initiatives of the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership. So, so the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership provided the funds for this Zoom account and the development of these webinars. And Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association, we collectively produced them. All right. Well, thank you everybody for all the questions and the shared knowledge, and most of all for the conversation that really afforded the chance for us to explore what that all means and to really take it in a way that we can all understand, and to form connections with like-minded people. So thank you to the Japanese people who over generations developed the life and living environment that's the subject of this webinars, and who generously shared this gift with the world. Thanks to the many artists, craftsmen, authors, and organizations worldwide and here in the USA who've made all this known. Notably, the North American Japanese Garden Association, various bonsai and suiseki clubs, and the Japan Sister City Associations, you know, those are clubs, and others, all of whom have been very supportive of this webinar series. Special thanks today to Sukiya Living Magazine for all the wonderful quote copy, and for, in general, for showing and telling how the Sukiya Living Environment's intangible essence may be realized anywhere in the world, all over, with a diversity of tangible materials and forms not necessarily Japanese on their surface. Thanks again to the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership for financial support. And thanks to the Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association for producing these webinars. We invite you to review other recorded webinars in the Japanese Style Living Environment webinar series to be posted on YouTube shortly.